Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to another installment of learning about React and stuff. Um, I'm your host, Rio, and I'm going to be talking and answering questions, hopefully. And I just put a link to a survey or like a poll in the chat. And if you all want to, if you feel like it, you can click on that link and answer a question. It's on confidence level, how you're feeling about the material throughout the week. Um, just I'm just trying it out, seeing if we can get some audience participation and all that. And I'll do a screen share too. Let's see, that should work. Okay, and just want to make sure, can everyone see my screen all right and hear me all right?
Yeah, totally.
Cool. Awesome. So here's this poll, and you can, if you want, you can use the link to get to it, or you can scan this QR code on your phone, and it should bring it up. Just just kind of gauging how everyone's feeling, and um, looks like we have half and half so far on very confident, and I'm getting there. So it's good. Um, so I have some slides prepared, and I will get started with those, and I'll do like a little like going over some concepts that I just prepared ahead of time, and then I'll open up the floor for like kind of a dedicated space for discussion and asking and answering questions. Um, and feel free to stop me at any point if you have questions, just on anything. I'm here to help. So don't be afraid to yell at me. And sometimes I miss things in chat. So just like uh, feel free to hop on the mic and, you know, ask ask questions and stuff. So um, and then at the end of this, I'll do some coding, and I'll basically do this week's assignment. You can follow along. It's going to be recorded too. I'm not going to do the assignment like exactly the same because I don't want my code copied one for one. I want to make sure that you're getting the concepts and you can apply them. But I'll be doing basically the same thing. So okay, so let's get started here. Start presenting. Okay, so today, this week, it's a little bit of a mixed bag of concepts. Um, the kind of title of this week's lesson on Code the Dream was a little confusing, I think. Basically, I normally title my lectures here the same as the title for the lesson for this week on Code the Dream, but this time it felt like just kind of a mixed random bag of topics. And so we're going to get like a refresher on a few different concepts, use state, and a little bit on props, and a little bit on lifting state. Um, we're going to talk about updater functions, which is a feature of setters in the use state uh, thing, and then some other random stuff. And then I have an agenda slide here. So introduction, I guess we did that already. Use state refresher. We're going to talk about updater functions. This is reference versus value types. This is more of a JavaScript concept than React specific. And not just JavaScript. This applies to all programming languages pretty much. It's a good thing to know about. And yeah, excited to talk about that a little bit. And then we're going to talk about arrays and objects in setter functions. So just with useState, so far you've been using just primitive values, strings and numbers and stuff. And this time we're going to talk more about using arrays and objects in useState. And then we're going to have a little refresher on props and on lifting state, and then kind of a dedicated time for discussion. And then I will do some coding live, and you can see the concepts applied and ask questions as needed. Okay, the confidence check. I'll just again look at this poll. Looks like there's a decent amount of people who are just getting there with the concepts. So hopefully I can help clarify. Okay, so we're going to start with a useState refresher. So if you remember with React, React's kind of primary purpose, or one of the main benefits you get from using React over just vanilla JavaScript, is that React controls it controls re-rendering the DOM for you. So normally in JavaScript, it's kind of a manual process if you want to update your HTML, the DOM, and React handles that for you. It gives you these special variables, and as long as you're using these special variables, React will automatically re-render any part of your DOM where these variables are kind of relevant. And it's the variables are created in kind of a weird way. It's not like a normal, not the normal vanilla JavaScript way of creating a variable. You use this special syntax where you say const and then an array. What you're doing is destructuring two elements out of an array here. And the array itself is being returned from this useState function that's provided by React. So React allows you to use this useState function. What you get back from it is an array, and then you destructure a variable and a setter function out of this array. It's kind of a strange syntax to look at, but that's just how it is. And once you get used to it, it hopefully just becomes second nature. The first element in the array is the variable that you can use, just like any old variable. And then the kind of weird caveat is that when you change that variable, you have to change it using this second thing that you get in this array, which is the setter function. The names can be anything you want, but this is just a convention. You say the variable and then set, and then the variable name. So count, set count. Just in a more generic sense, it would be like your variable and then set your variable. Those are the kind of traditional names that you would use here. And then this is, so this is how you create a variable, a state variable, and then this is how you update it. You use this setter function, set count, and then you pass in the new value, and then the variable will end up having the new value that you pass into this setter function. And then just again, a little anatomy on what each of these pieces are. This is the useState function. You pass in what you want the initial value of your variable to be. So in this case, we want the initial count to be 0. So we pass in 0. And then count will be 0 until we update it using this setter here. So the setter function is how you change it. And it's weird, but that's the way that we have to do things in React because it does a lot of stuff that makes our lives easier, particularly re-rendering the DOM. So here's a typical example of using a variable, a state variable from useState. This is an example component called counter. And then inside this counter component, we create some state. We create a count variable using useState. And then I'm going to skip over this function right now, but I'll get there. In our return, this is where you have your JSX, which is basically HTML in JavaScript, one of the awesome features of React. It allows you to write basically HTML in JavaScript. It's not technically HTML, it's JSX, which is a special syntax that React allows you to use. So this component returns a button. So this is the HTML that will be rendered when you use this component. It'll be a button, and inside, so we escape out of the JSX using curly brackets, and then we have a variable count. So now this is a button that will have whatever value that count is inside, and if it changes, it'll re-render that. And then we have an onClick, which means whenever we click the button, it'll run the function that we pass in. And so this function here, increment count, we define right here, increment count. And it's just a normal function that we make. And then inside the function, we want to set count to the count plus 1. So whatever the count happens to be, it'll just increment it by 1. And then this whole thing will be re-rendered when you click with the new value of count. So this is typical use of a state variable and then updating the state variable on click when you click a button. So updater functions. This is a special kind of added feature of those setter functions that we get back from useState. So this is the same component, but this time we're using an updater function. And the important part is right here. We have set count. This is our setter for setting the new value of count. And before we were just passing in what like a value that we want the new count to be, but now we're passing in an arrow function. And that is what an updater function is. An updater function is a function that we pass into a setter that we get back from useState. So we have our state variable, our setter for the state variable, which is a function that allows you to change that variable. And this setter function, you can either pass in a value, which just directly changes our variable, or you can pass in a function. If you pass in a function, then the first argument in that function will be the previous value of the variable that it controls or that it updates. So basically, it gives you access to whatever the count is at the time this setter is called. So previous count will be the value of count. And then whatever the function returns, which this is an arrow function with an implicit return, it's returning the count plus 1. So whatever the count happened to be, and this, I call it previous count here. This can be whatever you want, the name here. But the value of this variable, of this argument here, is going to be the whatever count is.
And when would you want to use the updater function like method versus just having previous count plus 1? It was saying something about it being like asynchronous and like there's a certain time you'd want to use it over the other one.
Yep. Yeah, that's a great question. That's basically, and just to clarify for everyone, the question is, what's the difference between, like, here we have access to count already. This is the not using an updater function. This is just using set count and then passing in a value, not a function. We already have access to count. So we're setting it to count plus one. And then in the updater function version, previous count is the same as count, right? So why would we need to use this if we already have access to count? Because previous count will be the value of count. The reason is because React is kind of weird and it doesn't, well, actually, my next slides explain it. So let's just, um, I'll explain it in I have a slide dedicated to that. So again, this is the comparison of passing in a regular value into our setter function, just like count plus one, that's just a number, and then passing in a function. So this function is the updater function, and it's special. So why do we use them? Aren't these basically the same thing? This component and this component, the only difference is this setter function is using an updater function, which gets the value of count. And this one also still has the value of count. So aren't they the same thing? Why do we need an updater function? The reason is because React doesn't change the value of that variable immediately when you call your setter function. It schedules to change that variable. It says, okay, I will change that variable on my next re-render of this component. And so it adds it to a queue. And so React says, okay, I need to do this thing. And then it has a list of other things that it needs to do also. And so the value of that count, if you call multiple setters in a row to change the count, by the time you hit the second setter, the count still won't have been changed. So if you have multiple setters in a row that are changing the value of count, they will all be referring to the original version. They won't get the updated version. And so the updater function ensures that they get the most up-to-date version. So React schedules updates. They don't happen immediately. So your state variables, and then here's kind of an example of kind of illustrating that the fact that these state variables aren't updated immediately. So here we're calling so we have count, the initial state is 0. And then when we hit increment count, we set count to itself, which is 0 plus 1. So we would expect count to be, at the end of calling set count here, we would expect count to be 1, right? We're setting it to 0 plus 1. So at this line right here, this console log, we expect count to be 1, but it's 0. That's what you'll see. If you run this code, count, even though we set it right here to be 1, we can set it to any number we want. Right here, it will not be changed yet. It won't have that updated version. So you expect normally in code, when you change a variable, that the next line down, that variable will have been changed. But with React, the variable is not changed immediately because of performance. It batches updates to the state. So it says, I'm going to re-render this component and I'm going to make all the changes that have been scheduled all at once so that you don't have many re-renders that don't need to happen. It's a performance thing. So what that basically means is if we want the most up-to-date version of count in a setter function, in rare cases, so you won't always use an updater function. I'll say that. You generally don't need them. They're actually not super common, but there are cases where if variables are being changed within the same render cycle. So for example, when you call a function, if you want to change a variable, if you want to use the same setter multiple times on the same variable, in that case, you'll probably want to use an updater function. So it's a little bit, I don't have like the most clear answer of when you'll want to use them versus when you don't. Um, Typically, you don't need them, but there are cases where you will want them, and specifically, you'll just see them. You'll see them, and if you see them, you don't want to be confused. You want to know what they are. I made an app recently that had some like physics stuff going on in React, and so every frame, uh, the state variables are changing, and those state variables are changing so fast that I needed to use updater functions because the latest version of those variables couldn't be used reliably. So an updater function ensures that uh, if your component um, has to change the same variable multiple times within one render cycle, it won't have the stale data, which means the old version of that variable that hasn't gotten the latest updates yet. So
So
no super clear answer. Oh yeah, go ahead.
would you recommend like using an updater function as like a best practices or like just not?
Yeah, yeah, I think it's a good thing to do. If if the new value you're setting a variable to depends on the old value, um, it it's probably good practice in that case to
Okay,
use an updater function to get the
cool.
most up-to-date version of it.
Okay, rad.
Yeah. And I don't have like, I mean, I was doing more research on this last night because I've used updater functions, but it hasn't always been clear to me, even when you need them and when you don't. So um, yeah, I don't have the most clear answer to that yet.
Right
Yeah.
on.
Um, okay, and I have a question.
Yes, excuse me, I'm just a little bit confused. So, when, as a result of this function, when we unclick of this button, okay, the first time the increment count should be like 0 and the count is 1. Yeah. And we like click again, it's going, I mean, increment count is always 1 less than count as a result of this function. Is it right?
I'm trying to understand your question. So increment count is
So
the function.
yeah, I'm just imagine because this function is returning button on click increment count and count. I'm just imagining that if we use it in a like HTML and use that click on the button, what's the button going to return to us first time, the second time, the third time? Is the increment count is always 1 less than count?
So increment count is not a variable. Increment count is a function.
Oh, it's a function. Okay. But
Um,
it's going to write something as a like and the console. Yeah. I mean,
yeah, yep.
yeah.
So it will output and the so the first basically count because we set it to 0 right here.
Okay.
That's the initial value of count. Um, when we first run increment count, count will be 0. And
But
then we're setting count right here inside this increment count function. We're setting count to itself, which starts as 0. So it'll be 0 plus 1. So right here on this line, we're setting the count to 1.
okay.
And then we run console log count. But what I'm illustrating here is that set count will not turn count to 1 by this time. By the time we do console log count,
Okay.
count will still have the old value. It'll still have 0.
Okay. It has to, but what's it going to write in the like this part, which is like the variable of the count? It's going to write 0 as a result of this function.
Oh, like right here.
Yes.
Yep. So count will start as 0, and then you hit increment count, and then the component will re-render,
Okay.
and then count will change. So we'll hit increment count, we set count to a different value, and then React goes, oh, this component uses a state variable that we have from useState, and that state variable just changed because we called set count. So now React knows we need to re-render this JSX here. We need to re-render that with the new value of count. So we'll run this function the first time around. Count will be 0. We schedule to set it to 1, and then we console log the current value, which is still 0. And then the whole component re-renders, and set count or count will now be 1. And so this will be 1 after that.
So at the same time, we have two different like result. And we have in the console, we have 0, but because it's rendered again, the result in the page is going to be 1. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. And then if we hit it again, if we click on the button again, then we'll get we'll set count to 2, but then console log will still say 1, and then the component will re-render, and in the DOM we'll see 2.
Okay.
So our console log here will always be 1 value behind what we see in the actual DOM.
Thank you very much. And in comparison with the other way that we had the function in it, I mean update function, the data, the variable is going to update at the same time, right?
Yeah, with the updater function, it would in this case still do the same thing, but we could in the updater function, we could pass in console log count inside the updater function, and then the updater inside the updater function, we would have the most recent value.
100%. Thank you very much.
Yep. Yeah, so the key thing here is that updater functions allow you to get the most up-to-date version of that variable. And in certain cases, you might change a state variable multiple times in the same code block without the component re-rendering, and you don't want to be dealing with the old outdated version of the variable. So using updater functions always ensures that we get the most up-to-date version of the variable. And then in this case, we're not using the updater function.
The love of my life. How are you doing?
Okay. So yeah, recap. The updater functions ensure that we're always dealing with the most up-to-date version of the variable that they're meant to set. Okay, moving on to reference versus value types. So this is not strictly part of the lesson Encode the Dream, but I think it's a topic that is important to understand because of one of the things that we're going to talk about arrays and objects in setter functions and why we need to make a copy of them. And reference versus value types is just an important concept. It's just a JavaScript concept, or any programming language, pretty much. You'll deal with this. And I think it's just an important thing to know. And so yeah, we're going to be talking about that. So in JavaScript, you have kind of 2 categories of variables. There's kind of, I mean, you could separate the variables into different categories based on different things, but this is one specific way you can divide the types of variables that exist, or the different types in JavaScript is you have primitive types and you have reference types, which are all objects. And so primitive types are numbers, booleans, strings, null, and undefined. And there might be some others, but I think Those are the main ones. And then all the rest are reference types, which in JavaScript, you might have heard everything is technically an object, or not everything, everything besides primitives. So an object is an object, which makes sense, obviously. An array is also an object, which can be kind of confusing. We think of an array as being an array. It is. That's how we treat it. But under the hood, behind the scenes in JavaScript, an array is also an object. And so is a function. And it doesn't really, you don't necessarily need to know that behind the scenes, arrays and functions are also objects. There's certain cases where it's important to know that, and it makes sense. And one of those cases is when talking about primitive values versus reference types. So these are the categories of them, so you can see them, and I'll talk about what those things actually mean. So primitives, which again are strings, numbers, undefined, null, those types, when you create new variables using those types and you reassign new variables, so here we're saying let a equals 1. So we're saying, hey, computer, hey, CPU, I want to store the value 1 somewhere in your computer's memory. And then we want to create a new variable called b. And then we're setting b equal to a. And so because a is 1, b is also going to be 1. And so that's what the CPU does. It says, okay, a points to a specific memory location in your computer, like in your RAM. There's a specific, like, actual physical component that has, or it's a memory address, which is a series of transistors, which can be ones and zeros. Behind the scenes, it's all ones and zeros. The specific memory address that A refers to is storing the value 1. And then B is another memory address in your computer that is also storing the value 1. So we have 2 different actual physical memory locations in your computer that are storing the same value. They're storing the value 1. So when you reassign, when you have a variable that's a primitive type, and then you assign it to a new variable, the new variable will have a copy of that value. It'll be a separate place in your computer that has the same value. So it's not saying A and B are pointing to the same memory in your computer. They're different places in memory in your computer, but they store the same value. So it's a copy of the value. We're copying the value here with primitives. With references, objects and arrays and functions, you'll mostly run into this with objects and arrays though. Your computer, so here we're saying let A equals an array that has the values 1 and 2 in it. It doesn't really matter what those values are, but A is an array. And then we're setting a new variable B equal to A. Well, our computer, because these are reference types, they're different from primitive types. Our computer is saying, I'm going to conserve memory because objects are often larger than primitive types. In order to conserve memory, I'm just going to reserve one place in memory in your computer, and both A and B are going to point to that same thing in memory. So we're storing one single array, and we can use the variable name A or B to refer to that same memory location, that same like variable, basically. So in this case, A and B are not fully separate. A is a reference, or B is a reference to A. they're referencing the same variable in your computer. And so it's not making a copy of that variable, as in the case with primitives. And there's some weird implications from that. So the kind of weird thing that you'll run into, it's a very strange bug. And if you haven't run into it yet, then that's good. Someday you might, and it's important to know how this works so that you can make sense of it. There's something called shallow copies and deep copies. And so for reference values, you can either make a shallow copy of an array or object or a deep copy of an array or object. And a shallow copy is exactly what I was just talking about. It's a copy of an array or object where they're both referring to the same physical space in your computer, the same like actual memory addresses. And so here we're creating a variable called cows. And we have some cow names, Betsy, Judy, and Ron. And then we're saying, I want this new variable. So we have this cows array here. I want a new variable, and I'm going to set it equal, or setting shallow copy variable equal to cows. So now shallow copy and cows should be the same thing. And then shallow copy, because it's also the same array, we're pushing a new cow name onto it. And then we're going to console log cows, which is the original variable. So cows starts out as an array with these 3 strings. We set it equal to a new variable. And then on the new variable, shallow copy, we're changing this array. And then when we console log cows, the original array, cows has the updates that we made to shallow copy. I hope I'm explaining that right. I might have explained that in a weird way, but basically what I'm getting at is if you set a new variable equal to an existing variable that has an array or object, when you change the new variable, the old variable will change too. Any changes we make to shallow copy or cows will affect each other. They're linked to the same actual object in memory. And so a shallow copy means both of these variables are referencing the same single object. And then if you make changes to one, the other variable changes too. And that's confusing. You would expect that you could make changes to this new copy of cows and the old version won't change. It's confusing when you are changing one variable and it's changing another one. That can lead to lots of confusion and conflicts in code. And so that's why it's important to know about how references work. These are both referencing the same memory location in your computer. So changing one of them will change both of them. So that's a shallow copy. A deep copy is a way to make a copy of a variable. So setting one variable equal to another one in a way to where changing one of them doesn't change the other. They're fully separate in memory. So deep copies behave like you would expect, where we have our cows variable, we create a deep copy of cows, and then we can change deep copy and cows will remain the same. So deep copy is a copy of them, but they're not tied to each other anymore. They're fully separate. And that's what we want, typically. Depends on your use case, but typically when you are creating a copy of an object or an array, well, really depends, but it's important to know what you're doing. And it's important to know, do you want both variables to refer to the same object so that they can both mutate the same object? Or do you want to create a fully new copy of them. And so in this case, and in most cases, you'll probably want to create a fully new object if you're going to assign a reference value type to a new variable. And so kind of the key difference in this syntax here is we're using the spread operator. So the spread operator is helping us create a reference type. So how do you copy an object or an array? How do you make a deep copy where the variables aren't actually going to change each other? They're not referring to the same place in memory. You actually have a fully new blank slate, or I guess not blank slate, but a new copy of the original variable. One way to do it is using the spread operator. That's the typical way of doing it for an object or an array. It works with both of them. So you say, I want my new variable, then your old array, you say ... which is the spread operator, the name of your old variable, and then you put the whole thing inside array brackets. You could also do this for an object, and you would put, instead of square brackets, you would use curly brackets. And what the spread operator is basically doing is saying everything inside of this variable that's separated by commas is now going to be placed inside this new object or this new array. So we're creating an empty array, and then we're passing in all of the values inside of the original array. So the spread operator is almost like as if you were to run a for loop on an array, then push each new element into a new array. The spread operator does that for you. I'll pause here. How's everyone feeling? Is this making sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Cool, cool. Okay, so this is a JavaScript feature. This is not a React feature specifically. I mean, React is JavaScript, so you'll use this in React. You'll use this in any JavaScript app, or you can. And that's kind of the important relation between primitive values. When you make a new primitive value, you set it equal to an old one. It's creating a completely new thing in memory. When you're using reference values, which are objects, arrays, or functions, setting them equal to a new variable itself will not work the way you expect. It'll basically just be a new name that you can refer to the same variable in your actual computer memory. So if you want to create an entirely new copy so that you can change one and it won't change the other, you need to make a deep copy. And the typical way of doing that is using the spread operator like this. Okay. Summary, creating a shallow copy. You can change one of them and it changes both of them. Creating a deep copy, you change one of them and the other is left unchanged because they're completely new things in your actual computer memory. Okay, and then that ties in with when you're using setter functions in React and you're storing objects or arrays in your React state, you need to create deep copies. So when storing reference types with useState, in this example, we have a to-do list component. We have our to-dos state and our set to-dos state. So instead of setting to-dos equal to a single primitive value, we're setting it to an empty array, and then to-dos will end up becoming an array with many to-dos in it. And whenever we set to-dos to the new, whenever we want to add a new to-do, if to-dos is already an array with existing to-dos, then we want to use an updater function so that we get the most up-to-date version of this to-dos array. So the updater function will have our previous to-dos in it. And then we want to return a copy of previous to-dos with the new to-do at the end. So that's that syntax here. And this is what you'll have something at the end of this assignment that looks like this. We're saying I want a new array that has all of the previous to-dos spread out, separated by commas. And then one more comma, and then our latest new to-do at the end here. So we're creating a new array that's a deep copy of the original to-dos array. If we didn't create a deep copy, we'd end up with some weird stuff, weird bugs that we don't want. Oh, sorry. Okay. Props. In my last session, there's some concept here that I definitely covered in my last session, and I have that recording up on YouTube. So I'm not going to go super deep into props or lifting state today. We can go over them a little bit, and then I'll answer any questions if anyone has. But I did cover them pretty in depth in my last video, both props and lifting state. So I have my videos, they're all up on YouTube. Feel free to, maybe I'll put a link in the chat. This is my latest recording. And these are also, you can see them on in the Slack, the talk announcements channel. I always do a follow-up post that has the recording. So feel free to watch this last recording I made on props and state and lifting state and stuff. But I'll just give you a brief overview of what we talked about. So props in React, props is short for properties. And it's a way of passing data from one component into another. So components in React will end up being nested within each other. Typically, you'll have a typical React app will have many nested components that you make. And when a component needs some sort of data, some state that was created in a parent component, then you can pass that state into the child component through props. So this is what they look like, or this is what it looks like when you're, so this is an existing component called to-do, and then we're passing in a prop called title. This is like the name of the variable, and then this is the value. We pass in a string called eat pie, and then in the to-do component, we can access that prop. So it's a way of passing data from a parent component into a child component. And it looks just like using attributes in an HTML tag. And then this is what it looks like when you have your child component and you want to receive the props from the parent component and then use them. A child component will have any component will have a props object as the first argument. So a React component is a function, at least functional components, which is what we're using. They have access to the props through this props object. So if we're passing in a prop called title from the parent component, then we can access that through props.title. Okay, lifting state, just a little recap on lifting state. And again, this was one of, I really liked the slides I made for this one. I really put a lot into this demo I made for the last session on lifting state. So definitely watch that if you're shaky on this concept. But a brief overview. So props can be passed from a parent component to a child component, but not the other way around. So you can't pass data from a child component into a parent component through props. To make a variable available in a parent component from the child component, you must lift the state. This means defining those variables in the parent component, then passing them as props to the child component. So you can think of it as if you have some state in a child component, but you want that state accessible in the parent component, instead of defining it and having useState in your child component, bring that whole thing, the useState, the defining of those state variables, bring that all into your parent component, and then pass any state that's needed in your child component down into your child component through props. So this, at the end of my example for last session, I had a car component, which had a gas pedal and speedometer. The gas pedal originally was in charge of the speed, but then the speedometer didn't have access to speed, and I couldn't pass the speed state from the gas pedal into the car component because the car component is a parent component of that. So we couldn't pass the speed state up in the DOM tree into the parent component to get to the speedometer, which needed access to it. So we had a prop, or we had a state variable in gas pedal, speedometer needed it. We needed to pull that state into the car component, which is like the common ancestor of the speedometer and gas pedal. And then the car component can pass that variable into the speedometer and gas pedal. And you also sometimes need to send the setter as a prop too. So that's another thing you'll run into in React is needing to use a function assigning a function to a prop and then sending that function, the setter function, into a child component. And in that case, we would refer to it as a callback function. It's a function that we're passing around as a value and then receiving that as a prop and then calling it in a child component. So the speedometer has access to the speed variable. The gas pedal has access to the setter for the speed variable. Set speed. We've lifted the state so that both of these child components have access to the state that they need. Okay, that's it for the lecture, the concepts. And so we can have some questions if you want. And then at the end of this, after this, I'll go into actual coding and show you how to apply all these concepts and stuff. So if anyone has questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'll move on to coding. How's everyone feeling? Is it making sense?
Yeah, it's all clear.
Cool. Awesome. Well, hopefully some coding will make
Our
it easy.
assignment is much more difficult.
Oh, what was that? The assignment? Much more difficult?
Yeah, when it comes in terms of coding for the assignment, it's much
Yeah.
more difficult. I'm stuck with the last portion of the assignment.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'll walk through each step in the assignment. And then at the end of it, if people still have questions, which I think I I had a couple people reach out to me ahead of time with some questions. So I'll do some coding, and then at the end of it, if anyone still has questions, I'll again be able to answer them. So if y'all are ready, I'll get started with coding. The fun part. And everyone can still see my screen, right?
Oh, no, you're not sharing anymore.
I'm not? Okay.
Uh.
Okay. Glad I asked.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay. Cool. All right, so just a reminder, I am not going to be coding the assignment using to-dos because I don't want my code to be copied line for line. So I'm using geese instead. But everything about it is basically the same. Just replace geese with to-dos and you should be good. So to start, I'm going to create a new branch on GitHub. So I'm going to open my terminal and say git checkout B lesson 1.4. It's trying to autocorrect to 1.4 demo because I already went through this as a demo. But yep, create a new branch called lesson 1.4. And now I have this new branch. And then I will pull up the assignment. Or actually, how about I start the React app? So you can start a React app by running npm run dev. And then it gives you this URL, and you can either, sometimes it'll open up automatically in your browser. Sometimes you need to like click on this. You can Alt or Option click, and it'll open it. Or you can just copy it and then paste it into your browser. And now we have our app. And I'm going to make it side by side. Sorry about my small screen. I'm at home, or I'm not at home. And I'm on my laptop. And I changed one thing. I had these geese before. It was all these titles were type like that. Then I changed it to title, and right here I see that this prop I need to rename. So really quick. This isn't something you need to do. This is a me thing. Title. There we go. So we have our geese showing up. In your case, it would be to-dos. Okay, so this is the state that we left off at. And I'm going to create a new terminal right here. In case you didn't know, you can press that plus, create a new terminal. And then we can have because this terminal, the one that we use to start our app, it's going to hang, which means it's going to sit there and be running a process. And we can't do anything with this terminal. It's just going to sit there. And if I want to use Git commands and stuff, I want to create a new terminal that I can do that with. So this one is dedicated to running our app. This one is dedicated to running Git commands and stuff. Okay, and I did make a couple little changes, and so I'm just gonna do a git add -a or dot, either way. I like -a. And then git commit -m, leave a message, and I'll say just set up for lesson. Okay, now we can actually get to the assignment. So I'm going to pull up the assignment here. So the first step, we want to move the to-do list into state. So far we have this goose list or to-do list right here. this is not a state variable in React. This is just like a regular JavaScript variable. And if we want to be able to modify this and have the DOM update in the React way, we have to store this using useState. So in our to-do list, or in my case, goose list, I'm going here, I'm going to find this variable here, and this first step is going to be taking this and putting it in some React state using useState. So create a new state variable called to-do list with a setter called set to-do list and default value of an empty array. And that's in our app.jsx, which is our like root, like parent component of all this. So I go to my app.jsx and I'm just going to say const goose list, right? Set goose list equal to use state with a default value of an empty array. And they have the red squiggles because ESLint is running in a React app by default. ESLint gives you, it's not, these aren't actual errors. These aren't syntax errors. These are recommendations based on this thing called linting, which gives you kind of best practices coding advice. And it's confusing because it looks like errors. It's actually not. And you can configure those. This is a little outside of the scope of this lesson, but I'm going to do it anyways. You can configure those by opening this eslint.cjs file and changing stuff in here. So last time I had people add this line here, which stops ESLint from complaining about prop types. That was an error that people were running into. If you're running into that error, then this might help adding that. Another thing that I did recently is I added one for no unused vars. Let's see, no unused vars. Set that to an array of 0, like that. And then I think, yep. So now these don't have the red squiggles. If you want, if I were to comment this out, now we have the red squiggles. So this is configuring which things our linter will complain about and not complain about. By default, it complains when you don't use a variable. So these variables are unused, it's going to complain. I'm setting that, so now it won't complain. Not something you have to do, but just, I guess, for fun, a little bonus information on how this stuff works. So, okay. So we created this new state for our goose list, and we set it to an empty array. So our goose list is going to start with nothing in it, and then we're going to want to be able to add geese and stuff into it. So pass the to-do list state as a prop named to-do list into the to-do list component. Okay. So our goose list, I'm going to pass in this goose list state variable, goose list. And goose list, like that. So this is a prop that will be available in our goose list now. We're making this state variable available in our goose list. Here, this part is the name, as if this is like a JavaScript object. This is like the key, and then this is the value. So the name of it can be anything we want, blah. The value is this goose list variable up here. In this case, and commonly, you might want the name of the prop and the value of it to be the same. So in this case, we're going to have a prop available in goose list now that is the value of this goose list variable right here. Okay, and zoom in a bit on this. So where are we? Okay, so we just did this. We passed the to-do list state as a prop named to-do list into the to-do list component. Now I want to open source/to-do list.jsx. In my case, source.gooselist. Add props as a parameter to the gooselist functional component. So this gooselist now is going to have props like that. Change to-do list to reference props instead of the hard-coded variable. Okay. So this geese variable right here is now, we don't need it anymore. We're going to replace it with this new goose list that we're storing in state that we created in this app component. So this is the new goose list. This is the old bad. We want this to go away. So we're going to delete that, but I'll start by commenting it out. Now, and here, since we don't have access to this to-do list or goose list in my case, I'm going to say props dot, and then whatever we named it, which we have to go back. Goose list is what it's called. So I'm going to go back into our goose list component. I'm going to say props dot goose list dot map. And then we're mapping through the list of geese. It's starting out as an empty array, so we should expect our to-dos or our geese to be nothing. So yeah, here, and we don't have any geese, none showing up because it started out as an empty array and we haven't put any more in. So we did that. Now delete the hard-coded goose list variable. So I just commented out, but we're actually going to delete this. And I'm going to copy it so that I don't spent a while coming up with those goose names, so I don't want to lose them. Actually, I had ChatGPT do it for me. Okay, so we got rid of the hard-coded goose list, and now we're using a goose list in state. Now run our application, verify that the to-do list is now empty. So yep, go to our thing, and we can see there's no geese anymore. Okay, so that was the first step, and maybe I'll do a commit. So we move to-do list into state. So go here, say git add all, git commit dash m, move goose list to state. Okay, I had a couple of things in chat. Okay, people leaving. Yeah, the recording will be available if anyone needs to leave. Don't feel bad about it. Okay, so we did that. Now the next step is controlling the add to do input. This is something I wanted to make a slide for, but I didn't have time. But controlled inputs are a thing in React, and I'll try to explain it as I go. So we're going to go to the add goose form and create a new state variable named goose title with a setter set goose title. So add goose form, making a new state variable, const goose title, and set goose title equals useState with a value of an empty string. And I think someone mentioned that they didn't need to import useState from React, but it gives me squiggles. So I feel like maybe it's a linting thing also, but I like to just import it. And the way you can do that, you can trigger your, what is this called? IntelliSense thing or whatever, your suggestions. If you trigger your suggestions, which I think by default is like Command or Control spacebar to bring up the list of suggestions here. I think that's it. I've changed mine, so I can't remember, but pull up the auto suggestions and then it'll actually give you the option to import it. And if you just select that, it'll import it for you. It'll write the import. But that's what the import looks like. This special thing at the end here is not actual code. This is showing me how big the file is. This is an extension. So don't worry about that. 4.2 kilobytes gzipped. Don't worry about that. It's just this. Okay. So we've created a new state variable. We imported useState because ESLint was complaining about not having it. So now we have useState in here. And then we created this new variable and a setter for it, goose title and set goose title. Now we're gonna modify the input to be a controlled input. And just briefly to explain, an input is an HTML element you all know about, and the value in an input element can be accessed through, well, you can have an event occur on the input and then select event.target.value. That's one way of getting the input value. The other way is through a value attribute. And so you can set the value equal to something. And that's the important thing in React. If you want the value of an input to be linked to some state, you have to say on the input, you have to say value equals and then set it to a state variable, which is going to hold that value. So I'm going to say value equals goose title. And then, so now the goose title will, the value of the input will be set to the goose title. But now if we try to change it, it won't change. I'm typing right now. And this value or the input is not changing. And the reason is because goose title is not changing, or set goose title is not being called. Goose title will never change from an empty string. So even though I'm typing into the input, the value is still going to remain this empty string that goose title is. So now to make it a controlled input, we need to say on change. And on change, we need to set goose title to the new value. So I'm going to say handle typing. I forgot. They had a handle title change. Okay. So we added the value prop. Now we need to add an on change prop equal to a function called handle title change. So on change equals handle title change. Handle title change is a function that we're about to make. So it doesn't exist yet, but we're about to make it. And I can't remember if they want it above or below. Okay, above the handle to do function or handle add to do function, create a new function called handle title change that takes an event as a parameter. Okay, so above this handle add goose function, which this function, if you remember, we made it last week. It runs when you click submit to create a new goose. And we're going to create a new function now called handle title change. And it takes in an event. And because this function will be called whenever the input changes, like that, it will have access to an event, which is an HTML event object that has information about the change or whatever event occurred. You've seen these in event listeners in default or like vanilla JavaScript. So this event here, because it's on the input, it will be in reference to this input element. And that means I can say event.target. The target for this specific event will always be the input. It'll be the HTML element there, the input. And then if I want to get the value of it, I can do value. So event.target.value will be the value of this input here. And so what I'm going to want to do is, and I think I'm doing this right, retrieve the input value from the event object and store in a variable named new to-do title. Yep. So I'm going to say const new goose title equals event.target.value. And I can console log this, and or actually, I still won't be able to change the input because we're never changing goose title, and the value of this input is always going to be that empty string. So until we can change goose title, the input is always going to have an empty string. So now we're selecting the new goose title from the event, and then we're going to set the goose title state to the new goose title. So just to zoom out and clarify what we just did, we're saying we want to store the value of this input right here. We want to store the value of that in a state variable. So we created a state variable for it called goose title. And now we set the value of this input so that it'll reflect whatever that state is. We set the value of this input to that state variable. But now the state variable never changes on its own. And when we type into the input, it won't register that we've changed it. So in order to fix that, we have to do an onChange function. And then in this onChange, we're calling this handle title change, which gets an event. The event has the current or the updated value of the input. Basically, whenever we type into the input, this function will run. This variable will get the most up-to-date version of whatever's in, whatever the text is that we've typed into this input. And then we're setting the goose title state to the most up-to-date version of whatever has been typed into that input. That is a controlled input. It's really kind of a pain. It's a little bit weird, but pretty much in React, you'll do it 1,000 times. You'll make a controlled input, and it's basically an input where the value of the input is a state variable, and then the onChange sets the state variable to the new value, like this. So now we can type into it, hello, and this state variable goose title will always have that up-to-date version. And I can show it right here. Just in our JSX right here, if I put that variable goose title, it'll actually show it. So as I type, it'll show up in the DOM. Hello. So you can see it showing up right here. That was just for showing this is not needed. Okay, so we have a controlled input now, and we're storing the value of our input in this state variable. And now in the handle add to do function, remove the to do title variable and update on add to do to pass in our to do title state variable instead. Basically, we're saying when we were submitting the form to create a new goose, this is the way that I solved this. I don't know exactly if this is the way that everyone did, but we submit the form, we get the form element, and then we were getting the value of the input through a query selector on the form. This is not ideal in React. Ideally, you don't have to deal with query selectors or any DOM methods. And so the better way of doing it is storing the state of this input in a state variable right here, goose title. And then we don't need these lines anymore. We don't need to get the input element. We don't need to get the value because the value, we already are getting it. That's what goose title is. So now when we submit the form, all we need to do is say props dot on add goose. I think that, okay, yeah. I think this part's gonna change. So let me in the handle add to do function, remove the to do title variable and update on add to do. The on add to do callback handler to pass in our new to do title state variable instead. Okay. So we should be able to add a new goose and it should show up. So let me try. Yep. So on add goose is now adding the new goose. And we never ended up putting the new goose into the goose list in the first place because we weren't storing the goose list in React state. But now we are, so that's going to be our next step, is saying we have a new goose now. Instead of just storing this new goose in its own state variable up here, we're going to actually add it to this array. And I'll do a commit now because we did a controlled input for the add to do or add goose. So I'm going to say git add -a, git commit -m, store value of goose title input in state. Okay. Any questions so far on any of this? Is it making sense? Okay, I'll move on. So the last step, I think, or wait, not last. We're getting there. So the next step, we're gonna, oh wait, no, we did do that. We just did that. So add new to do to list. Okay, so that's the next step is we have now stored the value of that input in a state variable, and we are saving that new goose in a variable, but instead of saving this new goose in this variable here, we want to add it to this new goose list array here. So we're going to open app.jsx, which I have that open already. We're going to remove the new to-do state variable and the corresponding JSX that displays it. Okay, so that's that. That's this variable right here, this new goose variable. We don't need that anymore because we're going to add the new goose to this actual goose list here. And I'll delete that. This was where we displayed it just for fun in the DOM. I'm going to delete that line too. And this will get resolved in a second, that part. Declare a new function named add to do. So we're going to say add goose that takes new goose as a parameter. So I'm going to say function in our app component here, function add goose, and it takes a goose as a parameter. So goose, okay. Actually, they called it new goose, so let's call it new goose. New goose. So I have this new function. It's nothing yet. Call the set to-do list state setter. So we're going to call the set goose list state setter and use the spread operator to pass the existing objects in the to-do or the goose list array along with the new goose object. So what is this asking? It's saying when we call this new goose add goose function, we want to set the existing goose state to a copy of itself with the new goose at the end. So if you remember this goose list, it's an empty array. Every time we call this function here, this add goose function, and we pass in a new goose, we want to use this setter for the goose list, and we want to set the goose list to whatever it was previously. We don't want to delete the existing geese from this list. So we want to set it to the existing goose list with one new goose at the end. And if you remember, we can use an updater function for that. And we can use a deep copy. We can use the spread operator to make a deep copy. So that's kind of where those main concepts I covered in the slides come in for today's lesson. So we're doing set goose list. We're going to use an updater function, and we're going to get the previous goose list. So I'm going to be just fully verbose here. Sometimes I might call it prev goose list, but I'm going to just say previous goose list. And then remember, it's an updater function, so it's an arrow function. And then whatever this arrow function returns, so it's going to get the previous goose list, which is basically the same thing as this variable here, this goose list variable, except in the rare case that we want to change state really quickly and React hasn't done a re-render yet, we don't want the stale data. So this will get the most recent version of it. So we're going to get the previous goose list, which is going to start as an empty array, but then it'll, as we call this function each time, it'll have more geese in this array. So we're going to return in this array the previous goose list with the new goose at the end. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to make a copy of this previous goose list by putting the whole thing in square brackets. So it's an array within an array. And then we're going to use the spread operator to say spread out the contents of this array into this new array. So this is creating a deep copy. So it's a completely new array that has the same values as the original one. And then we're going to add the new goose at the end, comma, new goose. So now any existing geese are going to be spread in this like that. So you can imagine like goose 1, goose 2, etc. All the existing geese are going to be spread using the spread operator like that. And then our latest goose is going to be added to the end like that. I'll undo that. That was just to visualize what this spread operator is going to be doing here. Creating a new array, the existing geese, and then a new goose at the end. And then we're setting the goose list variable to the version of itself with the new goose at the end. Okay, so we just did that. So we called the set goose list state setter and used the spread operator to pass the existing objects in the goose list array along with the new goose object. Now we're going to change the value of the on add goose prop for on add goose form to add goose. What does that mean? Change the value of the on add goose prop. Okay. So this on add goose prop here, we're going to set it to this function here. Because before we were using this old state variable, this one here, but we deleted that. And so now when we add a goose, instead of adding it to that temporary state variable, we're going to actually add it to the goose list. And this array that we just, or this function that we just created allows us to do that. So on add goose, and we're going to pass in this new function that we just made, add goose. Now we're going to go to our add goose form component, and inside handle add goose, we're going to update the, or I'll just go to this component now. Add goose form. So in the on add goose callback, or inside handle add goose, we're going to update the on add goose callback prop to pass in an object instead of a string. Object should have the following properties: title equal to do title, and an ID, which we're going to use date.now to get a unique ID. This is basically saying when we, in this function, which is a handler for adding a new goose, so when we submit the form, we call this function to add a new goose. Instead of our old way of adding a new goose, which just added a single, it set the new goose variable to the value, the string here, the new goose title. Instead of doing that, we're gonna call that new function that we just made, which should be available through our props. And then instead of passing in a string as the new goose, we're going to pass in an object. We're going to create a new goose object to send in. So first I'm going to start by just creating a goose object. So I'm going to say const new goose. I'm going to set it to an empty object. And then the goose title, this variable here, is always going to have the most up-to-date version of this input. So whatever we type into that input here, goose title will have that value. And then when we click add goose, we want to get that value and set the new goose title to this value. So this new goose that we're creating here, it's going to have a title. And the title is going to be this goose title state variable here. Then the ID, well, the ID just needs to be any unique identifier. And they suggested we use date.now, which is just going to give us a random number, or not random, it's the current timestamp. It's going to be a long series of numbers because it's in milliseconds, and it's going to be unique, basically. So don't worry about it. It's a long number, and we just want the ID to be a long random-ish number. So now when we do handle add goose, we're creating this new goose object with the correct title. The title is going to be whatever was in the input, whatever we typed into the input, and then we're going to call on add goose, and we're going to pass in this new goose instead of just the string, the goose title. I'm going to pass in the new goose. So we did this. We set the title to do title, or in our case, goose title. And we used an identifier, which used date.now to get a unique number. And then the last step is we're going to remove the reset method, which resets the form, and replace it with logic to reset the to do title state to an empty string. Basically, before we didn't have a controlled input. Now we do. And with a controlled input, you can't reset the form and expect the input to reset. So if I add a new goose right now, hello, it's going to add the new goose, but our input's still going to have this value in it, and we want to reset it. Form reset is not going to work when you're using a controlled input, which again is an input element where the value is being synced up with a state variable in React. And so instead of using form.reset, what we're going to do is just reset the value of goose title manually by saying set goose title. We're going to call the setter title to an empty string. reset the to-do title state to an empty string. So we just did that. So now when we add a new goose, it resets the value of this goose title. Okay, run your application and view in browser, enter a new goose and verify that it's visible in the goose list. Enter another goose, verify that 2 items are visible, so it's all working. I could reload the page, add a new goose, Henry, add goose, and there's Henry. And then, what's a good goose name? Lorena. I don't know how to spell that. How about, I don't even know if that's a name, but Lorena. Okay, so we're adding new geese. That's working. And we're basically done. The last step is just kind of a style thing. It's not going to affect the functionality of your app. It's more just a style thing, which is destructuring props. So if you remember, an object or an array can be destructured, which basically means pulling out individual values of an object. Like if we wanted to destructure the title out of this goose object, I could say const title like that equals new goose. This is destructuring an object. We're taking a property out of an object and assigning it to a new variable. And this is the syntax for it. Destructuring an object. So we're taking a property out of a variable or out of an object or an array, and we're setting it to a new variable of the same type or of the same name. And so now instead of saying goose.title, we could just say title. And that is our new variable, destructured. And you can do multiple. You can do title and ID, and then title and ID are now variables that we can use. Destructured. So a common way of dealing with props is destructuring them. And they often are destructured just immediately in here. So we have this props object here. And now everywhere where we want to refer to props, like anything inside of props, we have to do props dot and then whatever the prop name is. A more simple, elegant way of dealing with that usually is instead of having props there, we have an empty object, or not an empty object, an object, and then we're going to put the prop names in the object. So what are we passing into props into add goose form? Well, let me go to the parent component right here. So our parent component, we're calling our add goose form component, and we're passing in on add goose as a prop. This function, add goose. So now in this add goose form, I can destructure on add goose out of the props variable. So that's going to make it so that we don't need to say props dot on add goose. We can just say on add goose like that. We're pulling out the property of the props object that we want. So we're pulling out this property, creating a variable out of it, and we can use it like that. And they just suggest we can do it with all these. So I'm going to go to our goose list now. And we can see we have props.gooselist. And instead, I'm just going to say goose list like that. And then I can delete props and the dot like that. Do that here too in the goose list item. title. Title. And I think that's it. To-do list item, add to-do form. Yep. Okay, so git add all, git commit -m. And I did 2 steps here. I did the destructuring and the add new to-do to list. So I'll just say adding or add new goose to goose list and destructure props. And we're done. I know it's a lot. Okay, how's everyone feeling? And I am here for questions officially, so I can share and we can even walk through any of my code, or you can screen share and I can help walk you through problems in your code. Probably stop the recording too, but I'm still here